I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, welcome back Carolyn Baker, who has been a guest here on the show many times and got to do some production of online symposia a number of years ago with Carolyn. She is easily one of the most prolific authors in the collapse-aware community and a profound sacred elder leading the way for decades in this extraordinary collapse-aware conversation. Please help me welcome Carolyn Baker. Everybody, welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. And I am your ever-present host, Dean Walker, and it is a pleasure. For those who've been around for a number of years, you'll know that Carolyn Baker and I have done quite a few episodes of some kind or another of conversation, whether we're the ones talking or we're hosting an online summit of thought leaders about some part of the collapse-aware conversation. There are quite a few different ways that we've had these conversations over the years, and you know, now is no different, except in terms of who's on the screen. But in my experience, Carolyn, this is a very different time. This is more than just, okay, here's the future that we've been kind of dreading, but you especially have been articulating and predicting and perhaps dreading over time. It is not just that in my experience. It's actually come on far faster and far more atrociously than I would have guessed. So that's just me and what I'm bringing to our conversation today. And I would love to, I have plenty of questions for you about, you know, for those who don't know you, I believe you are the most prolific author for the collapse-aware community that I know of.
Well, maybe John Michael Greer.
Okay, but the difference for me is that you know, he does such an extraordinary job of the overview and these broad, sweeping and political analyses and so on. And while you include those issues, what I think your forte is, certainly from, you know, my reading of them and then integrating your work into my own practices, is you speak about what it is to be human beings together from a very much a daily life perspective of average folks just trying to make sense of this world. So how do we comport ourselves? How do we relate with one another? How do we have relationships? How do we have a sense of purpose, meaning, inspiration, the sacred, you know, and you've covered these territories on your own, and then also in a number of books with Andrew Harvey. So it's there's no shortage of extraordinary material. You know, if somebody's coming into this this extraordinary topic, you know, perhaps the most challenging conversation in the history of humankind, there's no shortage from you and Andrew, and of course many others now, but you've been at this for years. There's no shortage of your curating of remarkable sets of practices and suggestions and even prayers or invocations for each day to bring us to a sense of centeredness and a sense of focus in a good way. And I'm just going to loop back to what I started with. I'm struck by how these times are stacking up. It's really daunting. It's, you know, I thought I had a pretty good capacity to be able to handle these ever increasing demands on our capacity to be able to hold extraordinary cruelty, extraordinary willful ignorance. And, we'll get into items of, racism, fascism, Christo-fascism. I mean, we have some topics to cover here.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to briefly at least mention the remarkable track record that you have of contributing to the collapseware community and how we might find our bearings together. So I'll put plenty of links for your other materials, your website, and so on in the show notes. So after I've said all this, thank you for sitting through all that. It is a great pleasure to have you here. It always is great to talk with you. And you're one of the few people that I really feel like I can speak right into that jaw-dropping quality of what's present right now, this kind of vibrating edge of expansion, of daunting circumstances. And I'm hoping that you will just bring us up to speed with your historical context that you've cataloged for so long now.
Yeah.
And then I'm just really curious if you could tell us about, I know you've got a new book out, and I'm looking forward to you giving us a sense of what's there. And I'm also knowing that almost on a daily basis, there's another layer of trauma. There's another layer of just mind-bending, mind-exploding insanity going on. I want to call it Hannah Arendt level insanity of that which lays out the groundwork that fascism thrives in. So I'm up for whatever direction you'd like to go. If you'd like to speak about your new book, I'd love to hear about that. This is perfect timing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm also wide open to, if there's something that you'd like to just get into a bit before that, I'm just going to lay the carpet out and invite you to go. Okay. And really just welcome.
Thank you so much. There are interviews that I dread sometimes. It's like, oh man, what's she gonna ask me? Oh, do they really get it? But I've been looking forward to this interview for about a week because we're totally on the same page. We've done tremendous work together, and it's like, great. I get to talk with Dean. So here we are. And, you've used the word daunting a number of times in your introduction. And so I have to start out with my new book, which will be released in June, Undaunted, Living Fiercely into Climate Meltdown in an Authoritarian World. And I love the cover because there's all these ashes and burnt little pieces of bark. And out of it comes this sapling, this nice green sapling. And, the idea is, how do we be undaunted? That doesn't mean we're not scared. That doesn't mean we're not angry. That doesn't mean our hearts are not broken with grief. But we're able to feel those things and persist and move forward, and not in a heroic way like, well, I'm going to get through this, but more like, as we talked about, I think in the last interview, when I was talking about humanity's rite of passage, what is this crisis trying to teach me? What does it want from me? What is there for me to learn and to do in this crisis? So, this book is all about how we move into climate meltdown and be undaunted, even as we feel all these feelings, and how we do this together with each other, so that not necessarily we can get through this, because who knows, if we're going to get through it. The likelihood of our getting through it physically and surviving is small these days. But there's so much joy and meaning that we can find together as we do these practices, as we do the inner work that you and I have talked about forever.
Yeah.
That's why we're here at this time. So let's do it, and let's celebrate together this incredible journey that we've been asked to take.
Yeah. Well, if I may, let me just take a guess at where you're headed when, I get to read your book, because we've had these conversations, and I know you're continuing some threads that you've been on for a while. This is not like new thinking for you. You may have new elements or new takes on it, but the foundation of it seems like we've been at it for a while. And I'm just going to speak that into some words that I've been using recently for it. And let me just see if they fit.
Sure.
I'm pretty sure they do, but I just don't want to assume. What I've been seeing for quite some time is that there's the world, we could call the world that we're in, the business as usual global human operating system, we could call that the explicit. And that seems to be the extraction, the capitalism, the fascism, the stuff of the world, the stuff we see on the news. And it's the endless now doom scrolling of what's screwed up, and this is screwed up, and this, and so on and so on, all very explicit. And what I've seen time and time again, really what drew me to, create those online summits with you and have these conversations over these years, is that it seems like you keep bringing our attention to the implicit, which also includes, of course, to just remember some of the words that have come up time and again in your books and in our conversations. Words like soul, words like how shall we comport ourselves, like qualities of relatedness,
Right.
the sacred. And then you also mentioned about joy. And the only way I know to access any of those words, any of those aspects of being in life, is to be truly present.
Yeah.
And truly present to the implicit, that which is going on within myself, but then that is also ubiquitous. It is also a shared experience for those who have allowed themselves to open up to that. That's what keeps showing up for me in particularly the work you've done with Andrew Harvey. You both have a way of expressing that implicit, which is both very, very intimate and personal, but it is also universal at the same time. Is that fair to say as a way to talk about that, accessing the joy that you just mentioned, for instance?
Yeah, absolutely. Because the outer story is absolutely real. There's no getting around it. It's in our face constantly. There's another story. And it's the story that if we had remembered it, we wouldn't have the same outer story that we have now. It's a story that we've lost touch with. And so a lot of my work has been about bringing us back to that. There's this hideous, horrible story that's going on out here. And then there's this other story. And this other story makes it possible and easier, not easy, but easier to navigate this outer story. You're absolutely right about that.
I'm curious if this would be a good time to ask you for any kind of an example of that apparent duality that you're saying is bridgeable. Is there some way in which we can bridge it?
Mm-hmm.
God knows there's no shortage of things we can point at that are screwed up, that are deeply daunting, that are actually existential in nature. So it doesn't get any more disturbing than that. Is this a good time to ask if you might tour us through a way to bridge from one of those white hot topics to some other way of being with it that opens us up in a new way?
Well, I don't know about bridging, although, it's possible, but so much of the time we feel schizophrenic. We see the outer story, and we're also carrying an inner story, which many of us are aware of, or you wouldn't be reading my books if you weren't aware of it. And it's very jarring because, wow, there's this, you have this wonderful dog named Bo. He's such a precious guy, and there's you sitting there with Bo in your lap, and all your hormones are just pouring because there's this deep love between the two of you. And then you turn on the TV and some fascist, crazy person in Buffalo has killed all these people. And so how do you, I don't know that there's an easy way to bridge except to hold the opposites. And all of the time that this is going on, those moments of love and beauty and joy and connection with ourselves and each other and nature, that's real. That's just as real. In fact, it might be more real than what's going on out here, but what's going on out here is very real. But it doesn't destroy, it doesn't take away, it doesn't minimize, the beauty, the joy, the connection that we have been experiencing. They're happening at the same time.
Yeah. I would call that bridging.
Okay.
So thank you. That's
Holding the tension of opposites, but it doesn't
exactly
necessarily construct this beautiful concrete bridge that we can just dance across.
Yeah, no, I'm clear on the dancing part.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the point being the same, I believe. When I'm talking about the implicit, I'm talking about in that kind of pearl at the center of the moment, when I'm truly present, there is a way in which all of the current circumstances are held. And that does imply all of it, even the most polar opposites of experience. That pearl, that tiny pearl, can actually expand to include it all. So I'm with you. I've got to say that because you and I have visited this space a lot, I know we have it in common. And I've got to say that what's in my experience right now is just kind of my system just went, oh, yeah, let's visit this space together. And I'm clear where you're pointing and where we've landed out of your, kind of taking us here in this little journey. I don't, I'm very satisfied being here, and we've got more time, and I know the opportunity here of us exploring some other dimensions of what's going on and how to be with it and how challenging it can be to be with it. I'm curious if you could share, if whether it's in your coaching with people or presentations and interviews like this, or in your own writing, what you're seeing in terms of what are some of the challenges you're seeing for people as they're trying to hold this, what I'll say again, just what can be a daunting world. How can we, what are you seeing are the challenges at scale that you're trying to address with this most recent book?
One of the things that that I'm seeing happening in the collapse community is there is now much more emphasis on accepting it.
Mm-hmm.
When I first got involved with collapse back in 2007, it was all about how do we prepare and gathering the beans and bullets and having a homestead, and you know the drill. Um, and the spiritual and emotional pieces were not on the front burner at that point. I think I've helped put them on the front burner along with many other people like Meg Wheatley and Joanna Macy and on and on and on. And now what I'm seeing is there's much more acceptance of, oh, this is collapse. And it didn't end in 5 minutes like some of us predicted. It looks like it's going to go on a lot longer than we thought. It doesn't really benefit us to make these predictions about in 5 years, in 10 years, blah, 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 because all of these predictions are like getting thrown up in the air and diced and sliced, and, you know, here we are. So more and more people are kind of, this sounds like a real oxymoron, relaxing into collapse. It's like, oh, okay, this is what we're doing. It's not getting better. It's getting worse all the time. It doesn't seem like it could get any worse, but it probably will. And this is where we are. And so, you know, the folks, many folks who've worked with Michael Dowd, his work is great because he's really helping people accept collapse. And that doesn't mean you sit back and, oh yeah, okay, I'm just going to accept it and have a good time. You know, there's no way you can do that. There is one extreme that I worry about in that perspective, which is that we divorce ourselves from any activism,
Mm-hmm.
any sacred activism. And so we just say, well, yeah, everything's collapsing. You know, when societies collapse, they tend to go authoritarian. So that's what's happening. And, you know, and politics has nothing to do with it. Doesn't do any good. Doesn't matter if you vote. Doesn't matter this or that. So I'm just accepting collapse and living my life. And I'm not going to get involved in the activist part of it. And as you know from my writings and work with Andrew Harvey, who coined the term sacred activism,
Mm-hmm.
I feel very strongly that we must be involved in sacred activism, the marriage of spirituality and activism, the marriage of service and inner work. So I want to really encourage people, particularly in a time when we are becoming swallowed in America by authoritarianism beyond anything that we could have imagined. When I started getting involved with collapse in 2007, I never dreamed, you know, and here we are, following in the footsteps, relatively speaking, but not that far off, from many of our ancestors in Germany who left the country or stayed and resisted in Germany the Nazi regime. So I think it's very important to accept collapse and do the inner work, but also be of service. And I see much of our work as helping each other be safe. You know, I talked last time, I think, when you were interviewing me about my other book. I talked about Frank Schaeffer and the interview that I had with him, where he talked about in his new book he's written about his time in the pandemic when he spent days and weeks with his grandchildren and family, isolated and quarantined, and not being able to do the things that Frank was accustomed to doing, you know? And he was stuck in one place with his family, with his loved ones. And so the highlight of his day might have been baking bread, changing diapers, whatever. And in that process, he got a whole new perspective on the word care. What does it mean to care? What does care look like? And I don't know where this authoritarianism is going and what it's going to look like 5 years from now in our country. I don't like to think about that, but I think we have to think about that. And we can imagine possibly a culture where we no longer have public schools, where there's really a lot of economic hardship and a lot of stores are closed a lot of the time. And, you know, maybe there are so many mass shootings that it's really difficult to go outside of our houses, and we have to plan when we're going to take trips to the store. And maybe we have to invest in a bulletproof vest in order to go. I mean, you know, what, I don't know what it's going to look like. But I have this sense that we're going to need to help protect each other.
Yeah.
Help care for each other.
Right.
In ways that will exceed anything we had to do during the pandemic.
Yeah. I can appreciate that. If I may, I'd like to just put a pin in that to hold
Sure.
extension of that particular type of inner work. That inner work that is, let's say it's both inner work and the work that I would do to be more connected with and perhaps able to co-regulate with my loved ones and so on, including that advanced level of care. And that can actually be down to that kind of literally safety on the streets and so on.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to go back to when you first mentioned it about do the inner work. Mm-hmm. And you're one of the few people that I can talk with in this entire collapse aware community, including the mental health community, which I've been connected with both in the Climate Psychology Alliance and so on, that kind of that level of alliance and collaboration that's going on in the mental health community, which is still only a small part of the mental health community at large. Yeah. I'm also connected with a collaborative group of alternative providers, so not necessarily, you know, certified counselors and so on, but people who are offering resilience skills and workshop type support environments and so on, to be able to work on those inner skills. I still think it's remarkably small offering beyond what is now built up. It's like a giant built up right arm in our world called the mindfulness community. So we got mindfulness this and mindfulness that. It's like, right. Okay, I got it. You know, there are those practices in those spiritual traditions. And I would suggest that there are many different inner skills, inner capacities that we're talking about when we're talking about building out our inner skills, our spiritual reservoir, if you will, to be able to face into the challenges. And I want to just give you a sense of one piece of how I lay it out, and I'd love to hear your way of talking about it, because I know you've covered this ground in earlier books, like multiple books about this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. That is, I break it down into 3 different kinds of practices, for instance. So this whole mindfulness stuff, great. Mindfulness, stillness, Buddhism, meditation together, fantastic. I can't imagine a more important kind of cornerstone for a person's practices. Great. But that would be one example of a calming practice, or Andrew also calls it a cooling practice. And so those things that we use to self-regulate, to calm our system down when anxiety tends to be our way of going off balance, then that would imply also at the other end of that particular spectrum would be the activating practices. For those of us who go to the more depressive end of the scale, when we're knocked off center in that direction, what's called for is, when we're ready for it, to be able to activate parts of our system so we can engage again, so we can not be crippled by that level of depression that can ensue for people. The third and final in this very, very oversimplified way of talking about practices is what I'd call desaturating practices, which is meant to be perhaps involved with both of the other two, maybe even preceding the other two. Because what I'm asserting is that we have been saturated since birth in this culture to be full of the predominant messaging, the predominant narrative, which is to disempower us completely, to disconnect us from all the primary sources of meaning and relationship in a human life. And so we are disconnected, and we are paying the price of that disconnection daily. We're saturated in that environment. And so it is no small deal to take on practices that just allow us a little by little to get a nose above water, so we can stop what sometimes appears to me to be a fire hose, a malicious fire hose of 24/7 content and controlled narrative. So 3 types of practices when we're talking about this inner work: the calming or cooling practices, the activating or warming practices, and desaturation. And so I just want to leave that out there and see if does that spark you to share any of the sort of practices you talk about, or a different way that you might talk about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the way you've broken those down. It's so perfect. And the desaturation is very important. Sometimes we have to do that first before we do the others, because we just have, be able to breathe and get that nose above water so that we can do that. So let me just give an example. At the end of each chapter in this book, this is Living Fiercely into Climate Meltdown. So at the end of each chapter, I have fierce practices. And these are contemplative practices. You can write them in a journal if you want to, or you can just think about them and really sit with them. I have this chapter called I Love You, Son, but I Love Fossil Fuels More.
Ooh.
And it's about talking to your children about climate change. And, it used to be a long time ago that people would come to me and say, how do I talk to my kids about climate change? Well, now the kids are coming to them in mass. And, how do I respond to my kids who are coming to me? So here's some practices from that chapter. And I just ask, whether or not you have children, as an adult, you have a responsibility to a younger generation to model Earth stewardship. Who are the younger people in your life with whom you can discuss climate chaos and support them in actively responding to it? Just something to think about. Secondly, ask a younger person how they feel about climate chaos, and then make an effort to simply listen to them. Notice how you feel as they speak. Thirdly, if your child is involved in any kind of environmental activism, let them know that you're available to support them, and ask them if they'd like your help, even if you believe that their efforts are minuscule and will make no difference at all. If they welcome your help, get involved. Likewise, if you're involved with environmental activism, ask your child if they would like to be involved with you. Or in another chapter, this is the chapter on, give me a minute, compassion is not for sissies. And questions, where are you practicing compassion in your life? How are you practicing compassion with yourself? What do you already know about your shadow? What upsets you about other humans? Notice your anger at people in climate denial, people who are blatantly polluting and pillaging. Is there a part of you that quietly gloats when extreme weather disasters strike because it makes you right regarding what you believe about climate chaos? Take time to sit quietly with your anger toward these people. Notice where you feel it in your body. Are you aware of a part of yourself that is like them? Write down everything you know about that part. And here's a super fierce practice. As you sit with the part of yourself that you have connected to people you are angry with for causing climate chaos and collapse, ask it to speak to you and listen to it. What do you learn from it? What would you like to say to it? Write about your experience with this practice. And so those are some examples.
Yeah, fantastic. And, you know, yes, there are a number of those prompts, those questions, those sentence stems that are on the, I would say that they are rightly placed in the calming or the contemplative practices side. There are a number of those that are nudging into the activating practices side. Like when you're talking about those explorations of shadow, even though it's just journaling, just a little question here and there is, you know better than I do, there, you know, you're prodding, and that prodding is meant to be, of course, you take this at the pace, you know, you dear reader, take this at the pace that works for you. You know, I know that that's always present in your work, but I also know that there is no way to start down that track of shadow without activating at least a level of introspection that can tend to rattle us. You know, you and I both know it can get a lot steeper, the gradient than that for those who have a big capacity for doing that kind of work. It can be life altering, and it can be dark night of the soul, and it's a whole different dimension for the people who are at that advanced level. But even at the most newcomer level of introspection of, wow, is it possible that I have shadow elements like these disturbing things that I see out here that I consistently am bothered by, triggered by, and so on? Is it possible that there's some element that I can look into myself and find some learning, some growing, some way to be possibly compassionate, or at least understand another person, and so on? That's a rattling, that's an activating practice. So I just wanted to give you a sense of how I, you know, that easily something can be in both categories. So
sure, absolutely. Yeah, and so that's why I emphasize throughout all of my writing that any of these practices and our grief work that you and I are so familiar with, that you know many more people are doing now, all of that is best done in connection with other people. And certainly in person if we can, but online is helpful. You know, like my buddy Terry Chapman and I, who I've been doing a lot of work with, we're going to be offering a Weaving Threads of Grief and Joy online weekend, June 9 and 10. And we're going to be doing this grief work online, which is something that is really quite new and it's challenging, but we ground it in connection with each other, you know, so that, yeah, you got a shadow and I got a shadow, and I'm going to show you mine, and, you know, thank you for showing me yours. And let's just love each other because we're human and we have these shadows. and let's help each other heal them.
Yep. Yeah. I've been particularly, I don't know if it's enjoying, I think it is enjoying actually, integrating the work of internal family systems as a way of doing shadow work, because it's so inclusive. It's so embracing of even these very often dark elements of ourselves, these unexplored and unintegrated elements of ourselves. Yeah, so it's good.
And that's what our coaching is all about. I mean, I know you experienced this with coaching clients, and you know, a lot of people come to me and say, I want to work on my shadow, but I can't do it by myself. It's like way too much and I'm scared of it.
Yeah.
And the same with grief or many other issues. You know, it's like to be able to do that with another person or persons is phenomenally healing and much safer, actually.
Yeah. You know, you've seen me wrestle once a few minutes ago. I'm wrestling again with, there's this kind of spaciousness when you and I land in a location that your work and my work with people overlap. Often our way of even talking about it, there's so much overlap. And again, my experience of, you know, I'm just reaching for another possibility for us to go in perhaps a slightly different direction, to speak about another area that you or I see out in the world where we're seeing a need, we're seeing a deficit in people's sense of, how do I make sense of this part of what's going on in the world? And it just keeps showing up, and it keeps showing up with an intensity of, people get a sense that this is an urgent, important, oh my God level thing that I'm experiencing in either locally or globally, or, you know, at any scale. And I'm curious if there's another one we could just bring up for consideration in this looping through how to reframe it, what resources we can bring to it, and so on. I know that you've had a lifetime of both experiencing and then reframing and working it in terms of what now I know you call, and a number of folks who know what they're talking about call the Christo-fascist community, or for that matter, just the fascist and the authoritarian trends that are going on around the world. I'm wondering if that's for a different day, because I'm hoping we're going to pretty soon, not too long from now, have another round and be able to bring up some other issues that are particularly of concern for both of us. Would that be a place we could visit, at least briefly?
Yeah, we can start to go into that now and go into it more later, because who knows what's going to happen between now and later.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
No kidding.
So, yeah, fascism is something I never thought I would see in my lifetime really take hold in this country. I mean, you know, it kind of starts with, as we discuss this, I think a place to start is the complete absence of truth. What is truth? What are facts? I had something in the digest today, a meme by Neil deGrasse Tyson, who said, you can't reason with people who came to their arguments outside of reason. And so one of the things I talk about in my Confronting Christo-Fascism book is, you know, you can't have a reasonable argument with these folks. And so what I do, and I don't encounter that many, but what I suggest people do is just ask questions and listen.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you can't bear to listen very much because it's pretty awful,
Mm-hmm.
but to kind of play the therapist, I guess, and just listen to the rage, and above all, listen to the pain and the grief and the despair that wears a different suit of clothing than the grief, pain, despair that we all carry.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but it's there, and it's part of the human condition, and it's part of our culture.
Right.
But it's absolutely maddening when you watch these people talk about their rationale
Mm-hmm.
and what they believe is true,
Mm-hmm.
because it really is like sitting in front of somebody who says, you know, tomorrow morning the sun is going to come up in the west and it's going to set in the east.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, and
Right.
they believe that with their heart, soul, mind, and being.
If I could pause you, because I know you can pull on that thread and take us
Okay.
quite a ways, and I think the real depth will come in perhaps our next conversation.
Sure.
I'd like to I'd like to just pause and go back to that there's a state of being that's implied in what you just laid out for us. You just suggested, here's a way that you personally, from time to time, when you, in the rare opportunity that you have to talk with somebody from that population of the
Right.
planet, you talked about the ability and the capacity to deploy our attention. I'm going to use some weird words, so bear with me.
Yeah.
You were basically saying, what I heard you saying in my language is that you were able to have the capacity to generate curiosity, to be able to set aside your judgments sufficiently so that you could have the curiosity be out front, and you deployed your attention in such a way that there was that attention has a different quality when there is little or no judgment present.
Mm-hmm.
It's more expansive. It's less, honed in as it would be for the attack of my judgment, for instance.
Right.
And so those are some capacities. That's part of the inner skill set that we were talking about before. This is inner work. Mm-hmm. Inner work doesn't just happen because I do enough sitting on a pillow.
Right.
It's good foundation,
mm-hmm.
but this actually takes practice to be able to volitionally set aside my judgments, mm-hmm. to be able to soften my gaze, mm-hmm. and to have a sincere curiosity. And I'm spelling it out like this because I find there's some amazing podcasts, amazing books, amazing people. The volume of really good work going on right now for the collapse-aware community, yourself at the peak of it. There's a lot of really good stuff, but there's a lot of times of these experts that will say the word inner work, and then we'll move on. Mm-hmm. So what is inner work, and how do I do this? Mm-hmm. So for me, this is part of the work that I've taken on, is to articulate at each level, or if you will, of engagement, from somebody who's brand new, almost no capacity whatsoever, up to the level of the transformative, which is, at a very high level of ability. And so I'll wrap this up with like one example that I use for this particular kind of inner skill set building is, if we're reconnecting with people, if we want, it would be a really good idea to have exemplars, like someone we could learn from, how they presence themselves in that kind of conversation you're just talking about.
Right.
So there's one particular exemplar that I use consistently, particularly in the early classes and so on that people take, and that is a filmmaker who's both a woman and a woman of color, and who she's taken on the challenge of making films about are the very people who would most like to do her harm. White nationalist groups, white supremacist groups here in the States mostly, and she's from I believe the UK.
Mhm.
And her name is Dia Khan.
Mm.
And there's a particular, I'm happy to send you the link if you haven't seen it. There's a spectacular interview with Russell Brand interviewing Dia Khan. And for her to, what she literally does is take us step by step through the kind of interaction you were just talking about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she doesn't say, and now I set aside my judgment. And, like I was kind of stiff and listing out some things that one might do. What she does is share the presence that she generates, because it's really what she's crafted in herself. And I think that's what we're talking about, no matter who's talking about these inner skills. It's all at a presence level. It's all at that implicit level is presence. The explicit is about producing and doing things in the world and changing our behavior and so on and blah, blah, blah. So I wanted to mention that as an exemplar, as a skill set that can be articulated, that it is not just some vague thing that's mysterious cloud that one walks into called do your inner work.
Right.
No, there's some real, very clear skill sets that one can build out. And it's really helpful if we can see someone who's crafted a whole way of being that is so extraordinary. She actually goes in with a couple of other people with their cameras to make these documentaries in the encampment of those white supremacists.
Right.
And they are actually in relationship. It's extraordinary.
Well, another person of that ilk is Christian Parenti, who is a former white nationalist in Chicago, who's made wonderful documentaries. And he got one of these guys who was in the Charlottesville massacre, where Heather Heyer was killed. He got one of them to sit down with Heather Heyer's mother and have a conversation, at the end of which this guy was in tears and apologized. So, there are many people doing this kind of work, and it is an enormously skilled, highly skilled task. What I want to say about quote unquote, do your inner work is, I don't say that to people. And maybe when I talk about it in an interview like this,
right.
I'm not specific enough, but in my book, and in all of my books, what I say to people is start with your own emotions. I have a chapter in the new book, emotions are allies, not enemies. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means I get familiar with my grief. I get familiar with my fear and with my not knowing. And I get familiar with my joy and with all of these different emotions, so that when I'm interacting with a white nationalist and I say, that's really interesting. Tell me more about that. How did you come to believe that? I can sit there and be present because, the rage is boiling inside me and maybe I'm freaking terrified of this person. But I am familiar with my emotions, which allows me to be present, which allows me to do the inner work that I talk about.
Yeah. And that's been consistent through every book that I've read from you and every conversation you and I have had. It's just, unfortunately, it is still all too rare for people to make these distinctions, people who are experts in this field, if you will, of how shall we comport ourselves? What are the inner skills and capacities we can build to be able to be more present in the face of larger and larger stressors and so on. Unfortunately, in my experience, and I please, but this is for you, and this is for anybody who's watching, you know, if you know of other speakers, authors, video content producers, whoever that's doing this work, who are actually articulating at the level of different types of practices, different directions that people can go to actually integrate these experiences, these skills, these distinctions into their lives, please let me know, because I'm constantly in search of, and that's what that's certainly what I'm hearing your work continues to be about for decades now, and now just at a new level of articulation in Undaunted.
Right.
So yay. And I'm really hoping against hope that this is the next layer of expansion of this community, this collapse aware community. I think we've got that giant overbuilt arm of mindfulness. Okay, we've got the 10 millionth video about mindfulness from the same 6 experts time and time again.
And do we have our connection with our hearts, with our grief, with our fear, with our anger? Do we have those connections, the shadow work, you know, and all the feelings that go with them? That's great that we're mindful, but do we have these tools as well?
Yeah, beautiful.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah. I'm wondering if this is a good place for us to end for this one.
Yeah.
To tell you the truth, I want to get a little spicier with you next time, because I know you got some serious spice available. And we got some spicy stuff going on in the world that
oh God.
And I'm happy to get full on spicy, you know, as much as we want.
Well, you know, between now and next time, probably there's going to be some hearings. The January 6th committee is going to televise their hearings, and I think that's going to be very spicy beginning on June 9th. We have people running for office who were marching on the Capitol on January 6th and who helped organize it. We have a guy who was in prison and was in a primary. He killed his wife. He can't obviously take office, but he ran for office and won. So, hey, spicy.
You want spice? I got some spice for you. You know, and I just have to mention a couple of other items as little seedlings we can carry with us till next time. And I got to say that it's just been jaw-dropping to me, the bold, you know, it's just come so far out of the shadows, right in the face of the world for everyone to see, the suppression of votes, of the you know, shredding of the last remnants of this democracy. And most importantly, I have this upwelling, you know, fairly consistently of both rage and fear, followed by grief when I just let them all play out. Of the, you know, it started with Texas and the vigilante system that they used to drive through the abolition of abortion, and the vigilante took it to a whole different level, to truly a Handmaid's Tale level of cruelty and viciousness and you know, polarization that I just don't know how to characterize it beyond that. And so I want to mention that for future conversations. The challenge is, how can we all expand our capacity to include even these atrocious elements and still find the beauty that you time and time again looped us through as you cycled us through this conversation today.
What can we actually do
Mhm.
as activists
Mhm.
on various levels of the spectrum? You
Yeah.
know, maybe it's really quietly and simply on the down low. Maybe it's bolder.
Mhm.
But we need to not only develop the capacities, but actually take action
Yeah.
in whatever ways call us.
Right. Those last couple of topics, examples that we just went through, that we cycled through, for me, and I think I'm hearing that implied, certainly I've heard it implied in Andrew's layout of sacred activism before, is when we're talking about a diakon, for instance, or the Christian Parenti, yeah, when we're offering the opportunity to learn, to expand in ourselves, the ability to spark communication with people so very, very different from ourselves. What the example that you gave us from Christian Parenti's work, that was an exquisite example to me of sacred activism at the most intimate level.
Absolutely.
Of people from very different ends of the spectrum, and them coming together to find a seat together in the implicit.
Yeah. So how can Heather Heyer's mom sit with this guy?
Right. Right.
And how can this guy finally how does he get to a place of apology?
Yeah.
You know, how does that happen?
Yeah. Carolyn Baker, it's always so great to speak with you, and I'm more excited than ever for next conversation. I love how this is turning into a cycling through. Give us the toughest topic you got, and let's cycle through it.
Yeah.
It's not like we have some solutions.
Right.
How can we engage ourselves and engage with each other?
Right.
To open up more and more fully into the implicit and the immense power there. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to reading this book and our next conversation. And I just wish you well. It's so great to see you again.
Thank you. And as soon as I have review copies in hand, I will send you one. I won't insult you with a PDF.
No, actually, I hate to tell you, I mean, I would love
but you like the PDFs?
That's actually what I read these days. Yeah.
Okay,
but,
cool.
But bless your heart and thank you. Whatever form it comes in, I will gladly read it. And I just wish you and your fellow Coloradans all the best.
Thank you. We're going to need it. Thanks, Dean.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.